no one is really disputing the fact that tornado cash has been used to launder massive amounts of illicit funds. I think everyone agrees on that point. There is a reasonable argument to be made that, tornado cash should comply with some type of regime to, crack down on money laundering and illicit use. My problem is that the government is not making that argument. I think that generally speaking, I agree with Storm on the fact that, writing code is not, a crime. It's not illegal to write privacy preserving software, whether it's, crypto mixers or encryption algorithms. And that, the thing that's illegal is committing crime, like stealing money, laundering money, using money for illicit purposes. And that's not really what they're going after here. They're instead going after Storm for writing the privacy preserving technology.
Today's episode is brought to you by Meanwhile, the world's first Bitcoin-denominated life insurance company. Protect your family's legacy with the ultimate store of value and fight back against inflation eating your savings. Life insurance, now in Bitcoin. A lot to dig into with our guest who is now joining us here on the show, the founder of Citation Needed, Molly White, back on Coinage. Molly, it's good to see you.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. Thank you for hopping back on. We haven't spoken in a while, but I think that this case was the perfect one to get you back on to kind of chat because I don't know. For those who don't know, it's blending together all kinds of things when it comes to what this money mixer offered to basically make transactions that are normally very public on the blockchain very private. But that's not exactly what's going on in the courtroom. They're going after Roman Storm for violating the act of the U.S. government that essentially makes it illegal for people to work with sanctioned entities such as North Korea. And I don't know, I guess first, Molly, just your take on kind of how this one is playing out right now and what you make of the U.S. going after Tornado Cash founder Roman Storm.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty weird case to watch right now because, on the one hand, we've seen the Trump administration directing prosecutors to sort of lay off crypto and, not to pursue charges against crypto entities for, failing to register as an unlicensed money transmitter and things like that. But then on the other hand, they're prosecuting this case, they're continuing to prosecute this case against the Tornado Cash devs, and it sort of doesn't line up with the general strategy, and I think they've really sort of painted themselves into a corner with this one because when they dropped the portion of the charge, or they basically said they weren't going to pursue the portion of the charge pertaining to failing to register as an unlicensed money transmitter, they've essentially, said that, okay, we don't care that you didn't register as a money transmitter, but then they're continuing to try to prosecute based on all of these claims around what Storm should have been doing to comply with, regulations that they're now saying, he didn't necessarily have to follow. So I think they've really gotten themselves into an awkward position with this case because it really doesn't align with the general strategy, but they're still pursuing it for some reason. And so I think that's why we've seen so much chaos in the courtroom, is they're really dancing this weird dance around, not being allowed to argue that he should have implemented KYC and AML, compliance regimes because they're no longer pursuing that charge.
No, it is an inside baseball thing, and I think it is certainly, the pushback that I can agree with from crypto insiders is that, yes, obviously, you got to follow the law, and if the U.S. prosecutors are bringing this case based on certain things like that, they have to prove that in court and show to jurors, look, he violated this. I think it's a big gamble, though, having seen these other cases, and you were there for the SBF ones, too. It's like, when it's fraud, I think it's a lot more clear-cut. When it's kind of what they've chosen to go after here, and kind of the inner workings is a little bit more inside baseball, and that can go one of two ways. The jurors can kind of go along with it, or they can't and get confused. And so, I don't know. From a legal perspective, I don't know if you're a lawyer. I don't think you are. I'm not. I'm certainly not. No. So I've waded into those maybe less. Where I have been very interested to get your take, though, Molly, is kind of the court of public opinion. Because now we're kind of caught in this weird thing where it's like, okay, let's put the legal issues aside. Let's just talk about what people are debating outside of the courtroom here, which is, yeah, if people are getting kidnapped, probably shouldn't you be able to kind of protect some things on chain? And isn't that okay? Which I think probably most people and even yourself would agree with. But kind of how do you square what you're hearing from not just Vitalik, by the way, who's donated some money to help Roman Storm's defense fund, the Ethereum Foundation, who's talked about this and certainly put a lot of money into developing privacy blockchains. You're kind of I would put you in that camp too in terms of privacy advocate online. So how do you kind of square those things?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the age-old problem when it comes to privacy protecting technology. We see this with encryption, broadly speaking, as well, which is that in order to allow people to do things privately, you sort of have to grapple with the fact that that can allow bad actors to do things privately. So you see, for example, arguments against end-to-end encrypted messaging where people say, well, if we allow people to completely protect their messages, then we're going to allow people to do the worst of the worst things online, transmitting child sexual abuse material and things like that. And that's used as an argument against allowing people to protect their privacy for completely benign reasons. And I think it's a very similar thing here, which is, they're making arguments that, well, if you allow people to protect their privacy on chain by using services like Tornado Cash, then you're also allowing North Korea to launder billions of dollars in stolen funds. And it's sort of that age-old problem. I have never really found that argument very compelling that bad people are going to do bad things with this technology, and so we can't allow anyone to use it. Um,
Hmm.
because I do support people's right to privacy. And I do think that people need to be allowed to protect their privacy online, particularly today. It's becoming more and more challenging to do that, but it's also becoming more and more important to do that. And so saying, because a bad person might do a bad thing, no one is allowed to have privacy is, completely unconvincing to me.
Yeah, I think it's you and I might fall on separate issues here, and maybe it's just because I want to play this out. But I also think it is just kind of interesting when it comes to that push comes to shove moment, not just on the privacy front, by the way, but also on kind of like America's standing on the national stage using sanctions as a tool, because the only way you can really police whether or not people are following those rules is if you're able to know who's transacting. And so it is kind of like a race to the bottom in terms of, look, where do you draw the line? I want to play a clip, though, from Crypto in America. Eleanor Terrett asked Roman Storm essentially that exact question in terms of where do you draw the line on this? If you let anyone kind of transact, can the U.S. ever police that act that made it illegal to work with North Korea and sanction entities? Just want to play his answer and then get your take on the other side. Take a listen.
Do you believe the right to privacy outweighs concerns about national security?
I would say I'm not a regulator. I'm not a congressman to dictate what's better, what's worse. I'm not a lobbyist. I'm a software engineer. I don't make laws. I don't get to decide and think how it should. My personal beliefs, I don't think matter much at this point. I only believe that developers should freely write code without consequences for misusage by third parties.
So, I mean, I kind of agree. Like, like you said, it's obviously the case that, people should be able to build these things. And if bad people are going to use it, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't build them. But I guess in the push comes to shove on the privacy front, putting privacy aside, the U.S. piece, to me, would you agree that that's kind of like why prosecutors brought this case? Because it was the case that billions of dollars were being used to kind of funnel through Tornado Cash. It seemed like an obvious crosshair situation on Tornado Cash. So maybe not surprising that you and I are here talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's completely right. It's no one is really disputing the fact that Tornado Cash has been used to launder massive amounts of illicit funds. I think everyone agrees on that point. And I do think that's probably why under the Trump administration, they still did not, pursue, either dropping the case or, paring it back very dramatically, is because it looks bad to say, oh, this service, which everyone knows was being used to launder illicit funds, including by some of, the worst enemies of America, if you sort of believe the rhetoric around that, that looks really bad. It would look like Trump being soft on North Korea and all those kinds of things. But I think that generally speaking, I agree with Storm on the fact that, writing code is not a crime. It's not illegal to write privacy preserving software, whether it's, crypto mixers or encryption algorithms. And that, the thing that's illegal is committing crime, like stealing money, laundering money, using money for illicit purposes. And that's not really what they're going after here. They're instead going after Storm for writing the privacy preserving technology. And, the prosecutors have definitely been trying to dance around it by saying, no, 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 we're not prosecuting writing code. We're prosecuting running the service. And that's why we've been seeing so many arguments around the front end of Tornado Cash versus the actual smart contracts, because they're, trying to make a stronger argument there that he was actually controlling those front ends very directly and, actively hosting them. But, I think it still comes down to the same point for me, which is that, the people who were committing the most egregious crimes here were hackers, North Korea, cyber criminals, whatever it may be. Not Roman Storm, and the Tornado Cash developers who were allowing for both privacy preserving transactions by good actors who simply didn't want every move they make on chain to be traced, and by, North Korea and the worst of the worst.
I will say, I mean, like and I'm sure you'd agree from the SBF trial, it's like there are certain days and certain points that each side makes that you feel when you're watching it play out that like, oh, they scored some points on that one. And to that point that you just kind of walk through in terms of like, I guess, the jurors are going to go in a room and sit there and be like, hey, is this guy guilty or not guilty? And like, I don't know how much they're going to like focus on the inner workings, inner baseball pieces of this. Again, I'm not taking anything away from them, but kind of that push comes to shove, the government, and I wish I had we're working on getting the graphic from what played out in court, but to your exact point, there's the front end piece, and then there's kind of the command line interface piece to using Tornado Cash immutable smart contracts to do everything that the Lazarus Group did. And there's the reaction by Storm and his co-founders in terms of, hey, should we kind of like fix any of this, or should we do any of this? And what was really convincing was kind of the idea of how North Korea had to use Tornado Cash through the front end until maybe some of those changes, and they put the sanction wallet address on there. And so then they shifted to just using the command line interface. And you kind of see on this graphic where North Korea's usage of Tornado Cash after that implementation moves. And of course, you can look at that two ways, which is, hey, Tornado Cash tried to do something and it affected the outcome. Or you can look at it as, hey, that wasn't very effective because Tornado Cash still used this tool to launder all these funds. And I don't know how the juror is going to look at that, but I am kind of, and obviously, I haven't been there every day. I don't know if you've been down there, but like none of that really, I guess, matters at the end of the day when this verdict is decided, because I think everything who's building and everyone who's building after this is still probably going to build, and there's no real way to turn it off. If anything, that kind of shows is that like North Korea still use this anyways. I don't know what your general takeaway will be, whether he's found guilty or not, because all of this tech is still going to be built.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really two things there. One is that, the government has been making these arguments around what Storm and other developers should have done to try to reduce or eliminate the illicit activity that was happening via Tornado Cash. He should have implemented KYC. He should have locked down the front end more. And I think if you're going to make those arguments, you need to basically point to the clear laws that he should have been following. And, this is kind of a weird circumstance because, this is what a lot of the crypto industry has been arguing for a long time, which is that, the laws weren't clear. We didn't know how to abide by the regulations. And so you can't fault us for failing to do so. And I've generally found that somewhat unconvincing because the stance has always been very consistent on the other side, which was that, no, the law was very clear. You were, for example, operating as an unregistered securities exchange or whatever it may be. And these are the things you needed to do. And you didn't do those. And so you were in violation. But this is a very different situation because the government has basically come out and said, we actually aren't going to charge you for, operating as an unregistered money transmitting business. Essentially, we don't believe, or at least we're not going to try to prove in court, that you were failing to follow these laws. And yet we're still going to try to make these arguments about what you should have been doing. And that feels very wrong to me. You need to either say, this is what you should have done, you didn't do it, and so we are coming after you for that. or you need to stop arguing that, these are the things you should have done based on just like common sense. I mean, like, there was no clear layout of what he should have been doing if they're not going to, prosecute the charge around the money transmitting business. But the second thing I think you bring up is a very good point, which is that juries may not really care. I think that at the end of the day, a lot of jury outcomes are sort of vibes based. It's like, this was a bad guy and bad things happened. And, it sort of feels like he was involved in allowing North Korea to, launder all this money and all these terrible things. Scam victims came up and told us how their lives were ruined and so on and so forth. And so because of the vibes, we're going to come to a guilty verdict. And it's kind of unfortunate, but that is sort of how juries often work, which is that, it's a little bit less strict application of the law than you might wish to believe. And so I do think there is a possibility that we'll see a guilty verdict here, even if the prosecution did a bit of a sloppy job or had somewhat inconsistent arguments.
Yeah, I think that that's kind of the interesting thing too, and maybe this is the point of the interview where, as I did last time, kind of correct the record on maybe our Chiron right now says crypto critic, and I always am unclear how I should frame Molly White in these discussions, because I think it might be more fair to say pro privacy advocate Molly White, because for this, I mean, in terms of how you might want to see this go, everything you just laid out, I think, is exactly why this case is being brought, and why we're going to see this verdict, because the government wants to, as they did with the sentencing around SBF and all these other crypto fraud trials, they do want to kind of establish a chilling effect on people who might want to do the same thing, deterrence as it's known. And I don't think, even if Roman Storm is found guilty here, I don't think the sentencing is going to be anywhere near what we've seen from the fraud trials. At least I personally hope it wouldn't go that way. But it does seem like that's the main reason why we're seeing this happen. And on your personal opinion, I mean, I guess when you put it all together, one of the interesting experiments that we're trying to do with this one, as we did with some other cases, is letting our community kind of vote on chain with how they might rule if they were a juror. I think it is kind of ironic that some people were like, hey, I don't want my vote to be public, which is kind of the whole point of why I think Tornado Cash came about. But it is interesting. So I ask you, Molly, how would you kind of rule if you had to?
I think I would find him to be not guilty. I don't think the government has adequately argued their case. At least from how I've followed the trial, it does not seem to me that he should be held responsible for failing to implement compliance mechanisms when they won't say what those compliance mechanisms should have been. It frankly doesn't seem fair to me. And, the charges around money laundering and sanctions evasion, appear to me more to be an attempt to lay blame at Storm's feet for the actions of people who are using the service than for anything that he personally did.
I think that's partially why we've seen so many people in crypto donate to his cause. I think it's up to, the Ethereum Foundation was matching donations, so that was kind of a big piece. But also now, I think beyond 3 million, and he was asking for even more around defending this. And of course, as we've covered, it does cost quite a bit to land all these things and to pay your team of lawyers. By the way, interesting to see that he's also using the same lawyers that Do Kwon is using as well. But it's kind of been surprising to see how many people have rallied around him. And I guess based on what you just said, I would put you in the camp of someone who also doesn't want to see him be found guilty. Have you thought, personally, does this make you less of a crypto critic?
I don't think so. I think my stance on this has been fairly consistent. Some of the first things that I wrote about crypto, years ago when I was starting to focus on this area was that crypto is really hard to use if you want to preserve your privacy online. I wrote about abuse using blockchain transaction tracing because, if people can see everything that you're doing, especially if we're, living in a future world that some people envision where, practically every transaction you make is on chain, it's a really scary world because that's very public. Tracing is very easy to do. And that's, a very scary thing to have everything open in that way. And so I have always sort of understood why services like Tornado Cash exist, because if you want to have any semblance of privacy on chain, you have to essentially launder your own money. And that's, an argument that Storm and his defense team have been making, which is that, like, yeah, it's actually really hard to have privacy when you're using crypto. And so, I think my views on that have always been fairly consistent, and that, my views around other portions of the crypto ecosystem around, sort of the rampant fraud and the scams and the sort of attempts to circumvent other financial regulations are sort of a separate thing. Because I do think that people should stop, committing fraud and, trying to steal money from people, and that there's too much of that happening in crypto. But, people who want to maintain privacy online, I have no beef with that.
I would agree, and I think it's listen. I mean, me personally, it's also very interesting to kind of now be at odds with you on these issues, where like most of crypto probably agrees with you, and I'm kind of in the other camp that it's like, hey, you got to draw the line somewhere, and it seems like maybe if you're an American, you might want some of the tools that we use to be protected, but I don't know what that means for permissionlessness and liberties. It's a very complicated thing.
I would say that I think there is a fair argument to be made there. There is a reasonable argument to be made that, Tornado Cash should comply with some type of regime to, crack down on money laundering and illicit use. My problem is that the government is not making that argument. If they're going to argue that Tornado Cash should have registered as a money transmitting business, I'm, kind of okay with that. I think that people can disagree on whether those things should apply to them. But the government's arguments would be a lot more consistent if they were making that argument, which they originally were going to do. And then, Trump took office. Blanche issued a memo saying we're going to stop prosecuting crypto companies, essentially. And especially, we're not going to prosecute charges around failing to register as a money services business, failures to follow the Bank Secrecy Act, et cetera, et cetera. And so the prosecutors in the Tornado Cash case said, okay, we're not going to pursue this charge. And that's, I think, where everything fell apart in my mind. Because prior to that, they were at least being consistent that, these were the clear rules that Storm needed to be following around compliance, around, cracking down on sanctions evasion and money laundering, et cetera. And then he didn't do that. And so we're taking him to task for that. That is at least consistent.
It is, yes, but it is also tricky because you had an administration change. So, I think we would probably both agree that if Democrats were still in charge, it would have been consistent. But then you had Jay Clayton come in, and they have to work with this memo that Trump's DOJ is pushing through. And it is, I mean, they're the same. The attorneys who are working on this one are the same ones who were there against SBF, and so that is interesting to think about. Still carryovers from, I don't want to say the underlings, but farther below, the guy running the SDNY. And so, yes, I would agree that, and I'm just bringing it up too because this is essentially the filing that happened, the date on that one in May 15 that basically undid and said, hey, we're not going to go after the unlicensed money transfer business. But I do think kind of backing up and extending this to the broader question of, would it be an issue if you had, I don't know, an Aztec or some of these privacy protecting blockchains being built as Ethereum layer 2s? Certainly those ones, and I'm just bringing up the indictment to scroll down to where it was. I mean, I think the interesting thing is and the government did a good job of presenting this to the jury, if you want to go fully inside baseball as I scroll, is that they basically had this in the indictment, which was, look, at one point, more than 90% of all the deposits into Tornado Cash's service for a source that could be identified were attributable to criminal exploit. And so, I think they did a pretty good job of telling the jury, look, the majority of this was basically laundered funds. And I think if you were to kind of start with a blockchain like an Aztec that was general purpose and eventually had other things normal people using it who just want to protect their privacy, which I know was on Tornado Cash too. I'm not saying that it wasn't. But it from a picture perspective looks very different. So I don't know. I throw that out there because certainly I would agree with you that this whole thing got jumbled. And now we're kind of at a point where even the people in the courtroom are kind of confused as to which way this is going to go, which is a weird thing as a journalist to be covering it because it's not like with SBF where it's okay, there's a fraud trial. I think everyone knows what's going on here. This one's, I don't know what to make of this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mess. And I think it's partly because the Trump administration has been so inconsistent in their crypto related activities, which is that, in my view, Trump has been pressing for changes in the crypto world that benefit him and his allies. And so you see, memos like the one that Blanche made, which, basically say, don't worry, guys, all of you who've been failing to register and all that kind of thing. Don't have to worry about prosecutions anymore. You're good to go. We've been seeing the dropped cases from the SEC. We've been seeing sort of this pullback on crypto enforcement. But then on the other hand, you have a case like this where, I think probably the Trump administration and the Justice Department either feels like the case is too far along and so they can't just hit the brakes now, or they think it would be bad optics to essentially stop prosecuting a case against a service that has, been used to launder funds for North Korea and, does have a substantial amount of criminal activity going through it. And so you have this weird dichotomy where it's like, all right, we're not going to prosecute these cases, but we are going to prosecute this case. And then you end up in this like weird pretzel where the prosecution is not allowed to make a bunch of arguments that previously might have been compelling if they were going to continue prosecuting that charge. And so I think that's really where everything is falling apart here, is just that, the approach has suddenly become very, very convoluted. Whether or not that actually changes the outcome, I think is going to be a different question, because I do think juries are probably going to see, quotes like the one you just showed around the percentage of illicit activity that was happening through Tornado Cash and feel, sort of similarly to how you described it earlier in the episode, which is, should we be allowing this type of service if it is mostly being used for crime? And, I think that a lot of sort of everyday people would say, no, easy choice. We shouldn't, without necessarily, delving into the fairness or the sort of legal rigor that I think should be applied in these cases.
Yeah. Well, I'll close with this because I do think it is kind of, I mean, where we do definitely agree and where crypto and people who maybe don't like crypto agree is that like there hasn't been clarity, and it does behoove regulators or prosecutors after the fact to kind of leverage that into being able to say, well, you didn't do enough. And it's like, yes, because we didn't know what to do. And so it always kind of, I think, puts the prosecutors and the government in a position of strength to not provide that clarity. And now we're seeing that maybe change. But
I don't know if I would agree with that, because I think prior to the Trump administration, there was at least consistency from prosecutors on that point, which is that they said that, it was clear. You are saying that it wasn't clear, but we were very clear. And so we are going to go after you under those failure to register doctrines. And that's, I think, the real flaw here, is that the prosecutors have suddenly said, you know what, never mind. We don't think you needed to have registered as a money transmitting business, but we're still going to argue that you should have done A, B, and C, which just so happen to be the things that are dictated by the money transmitting business, regulations, but we're not going to say that you failed to do those.
Yeah, I guess you could make the argument too that it was the same thing for specific stances that the SEC took around like ETH is not a commodity, but then said that it was. And so there were like a lot of these same things where it's like, we're not going to tell you what it falls under. And by the way, transition into where I think personally, this is very strange for me to kind of like watch it all play out, is seeing the way that like, I don't know, I'm not a developer. You're much more in the developer camp than I am, certainly. So I would say that that's your kind of like where you operate. My background's more in econ, and so like I think it's very interesting to see kind of crypto rally around this idea of like, hey, just because someone's writing code, carte blanche, everything's kosher, we got to protect that. It's free speech. And then on the economic side, and I'm just talking about this as someone who's watching it play out, but I do think it is interesting to think about kind of like, obviously, Do Kwon's case is very dissimilar from what we're watching here. It's not a privacy issue, and it's not everything that's being discussed. It's fraud. That's what the government's going after for what Do Kwon and Terra said around their stablecoin. But the idea of experimenting with some sort of stablecoin that might fail is also, I think, why we're seeing the government and why they passed the Genius Act, is because that is maybe one of the few spots where like, okay, this umbrella catch-all of we need to protect people might actually be right, with the idea of like, hey, what's this stablecoin backed by? But certainly, they are probably going to fail too. Like we saw USDC DPEG, and the idea of maybe some of this clarity being provided in the kind of arena of we need to protect users and experimentation and allowing experimentation is kind of an interesting thing to kind of, I guess, foil what's happening with Roman Storm in his case, and the idea of maybe people trying to experiment just as well on the economic side. Obviously, no one's going to make that argument, and someone would probably get shouted down if they ever said, hey, if you want to free Roman Storm, you got to free Do Kwon. I'm not saying that necessarily, but I do think it is kind of interesting to think about the way that code is being discussed as free speech versus the idea of like economic experimentation in crypto. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to a fairly there's a distinction, I think, between writing code and running code. And that is what is, a lot of this is coming down to. It's fairly well established that, you can write a computer virus. Like, it is allowed for you to write, a devastating computer virus. But as soon as you deploy that computer virus and actually, sick it on someone else's systems, then you're breaking the law. And I think that is a very good state of affairs, frankly, that, you should be allowed to write code that can be used for very negative purposes because it allows for things like security research, for example. If you weren't allowed to write a virus, then it would be very challenging for, good faith security researchers to be able to essentially red team, various products. But it also, I do agree that you should not be allowed to just deploy some virus on your local hospital, right? And so I think that's what it comes down to here. And it's why we're seeing this weird dance from prosecutors, which is that they are not trying to argue, or at least they say they're not trying to argue, that Storm was breaking the law merely by writing the smart contracts that power Tornado Cash. They're trying to argue it crossed over into breaking the law when he deployed those smart contracts especially when he was running the front end, which was sort of a more active participatory activity. And that was where he was breaking the law. And so I think that's sort of what it comes down to with something like the Terra stablecoin, which is that like you can write the smart contract, even if it may be flawed. But once you deploy that smart contract, once you start actively soliciting funds for the project, Do Kwon was very involved in the ongoing operations of Terra, which was less, I think, decentralized than the Tornado Cash developers can argue Tornado Cash was. That's where it crossed over into breaking the law. So I think that's sort of the general stance when it comes to code is speech. Is writing the code is okay, but once you are running that code, you do take responsibility for the outcomes of that activity.
No, I think as you were saying, virus and kind of the idea of building a virus, as long as it doesn't get released on anyone, it was like kind of, reflecting on Wuhan and COVID and everything too, because it's also, I guess that's a very real virus that may have been kind of in the same camp. But you're right to point out everything around Do Kwon. And I think also this case, it's been interesting. I was just looking at Kalshi because this is one that we kind of like also, I was tweeting about it, and then Kalshi added this prediction market for a pardon for Do Kwon potentially. I think odds right now are like at 5% there. And potentially Roman Storm could very well fall under the same thing, even if he is found guilty. But I don't think that that's going to be the win that either privacy advocates want to see, crypto advocates want to see, for the reasons you just stated, because, it might keep him out of jail, but it's not necessarily the idea of defending the liberty of being able to experiment the way that you did. What would you think about that if it were to play out? That would certainly fall under your assessment of the issue, which is Trump's admin kind of caught in this weird back and forth between how they handle this one. But would that be an outcome that would make anybody happy?
A pardon?
Yeah.
For Roman Storm? I don't think so. I mean, I don't necessarily, I'm very cynical about the Trump administration, which has probably been clear, but I don't think that there is any real reason that Trump would want to do that. That I think that is partly why this has not been a case that, Trump and his administration has made into, a sort of focal point of their crypto strategy, even though pursuing this case seems to be, in conflict with a lot of the stated goals of his administration. So I would be surprised to see a pardon come out of this because I don't think there is any real benefit to Trump in doing that. And I think that is really what motivates a lot of his pardon strategy. I think that, for example, his pardon of Ross Ulbricht was very self-serving in that he believed it was going to earn him votes. And I don't think that the sort of stated reasons for that pardon were particularly accurate. I don't think that Trump has any real love for Ross Ulbricht or what he was trying to do with the Silk Road. And so I would be surprised to see that happen here. But, if it were to happen, I think I sort of agree with you that I don't think it would really change things from a philosophical standpoint. Because, evidently the Justice Department is still willing to pursue these cases. They are still willing to sort of vigorously argue them in court. And then, the pardon after the fact doesn't really clear the air for future developers or future crypto users as far as what is and is not permissible.
I guess on the last bit, while we have you, and I'm sure I'll let you go after this one, but I think, first of all, thank you very much for joining us, because it's been super helpful as we watch and try and see how this is all playing out, to get other people's takes on this case, and certainly people who have, built a career on protecting privacy and developing things as you have. But the last one is just kind of your general take on where we're at with crypto and politics, because midterms as well, I think crypto is not going away in terms of influencing where things go. Obviously, we haven't spoken to you since the Genius Act got passed, Clarity Act got passed the House. And just kind of curious to get your take on how you've reflected on that too, as these things have played out in DC and the midterms approach. Has anything gotten potentially more problematic in your mind?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's kind of a disaster right now in terms of the political end of things in the crypto industry. The degree to which the crypto lobby is essentially flexing money to try to influence the outcome of congressional votes is pretty disturbing, I think. We're seeing pretty direct threats to Congress people saying, essentially, if you don't support our legislation, we're going to come after you in the midterms. And, I think it's pretty disgusting to see money being used to influence politics to this degree. I mean, the sort of rebuke to this is like, well, everybody does it. And it's like, yeah, and nobody should. I think that it's, there's a serious problem in this country around the degree to which money is used to, essentially buy politicians, and the crypto industry has embraced it full-throatedly. And, it is leading to these pretty horrific outcomes. And so I'm, sort of waiting for the midterms with horror, because, I think we're going to see a lot more of this aggressive lobbying, these very direct threats to politicians, and essentially pressure being put on representatives to not reflect the needs of their constituents, but instead to prioritize where they can essentially earn the most money from corporate donors. And I think that's a really upsetting state of affairs for, American democracy.
Yeah, I think in terms of all that playing out, I do think that the speed, and we covered this, obviously, chatting with the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, French Hill, and a few others, and kind of seeing the process that it went through was pretty eye-opening in terms of the speed and the idea of all Republicans working together. Of course, things may change pretty quickly. Obviously, we're not going to delve into it in this interview, but the idea of what's happening with Epstein and where things go in the midterms potentially could kind of flip all of this, and we'll see how that goes. But in general, things moving very quickly, and not normally the case for a lot of issues in D.C. But this one did. So you're not wrong there.
Well, I guess when you have hundreds of millions of dollars to threaten Congress people, you can get things moving more quickly than otherwise.
Yeah, I still think it's very odd. All the research around polling on crypto, I don't know. It's a little dubious. Like, you can walk around and you can go to these Stand With Crypto events and you can kind of talk to people. I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen, certainly to the size of any of the other protests in America, like people showing up in mass to be like, I love crypto. And I'm saying that even as the host of Coinage. Like, certainly all of our members believe where this technology can help people in governance when it's used properly, in trying to do these things legally in the U.S. But I do think, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see how the midterms play out. Hopefully, we can have you back on before then and maybe chat about it going into all that. But for now, we'll leave it there as we continue to watch and see how this Roman Storm trial will play out. Molly White, can't thank you enough for coming on. Thank you again for the time.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's going to do it for us here on Coinage. Of course, you can check out all of Molly's work, Citation Needed, the newsletter. I would recommend subscribing to that one as well to learn a little bit more about all this. Love having differing opinions on the show. Honestly, that's kind of That's what we're here for. And of course, thank you to all of our members at Coinage who have voted in our snapshot poll to kind of figure out where your guys' takes are on the Roman Storm trial. As a community-owned media outlet, that is what fuels us in trying to figure out what the people want. The voice of the people here at Coinage. For Molly, for myself, for everybody else, thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you guys again soon.